The screaming started at exactly 3:17 a.m., just like it had every night for the past 6 months. Sarah Mitchell pressed her palms against her ears, but the sound pierced through the thin walls of the boarding house like glass shards cutting through silence. Children's voices, tortured and desperate, echoing from the direction of Millfield's residential district where families had once lived in peace. But this wasn't just crying. This was something else entirely, a sound that made grown men weep and strong women question their faith. The children of Millfield, Kansas, were dying from the inside out, and no doctor, priest, or specialist from 3 states over had been able to explain why healthy youngsters were wasting away while speaking in languages that didn't exist. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had arrived in Millfield 3 days ago on the evening train from Kansas City, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and a letter written in broken English from a man named Thomas Hartwell. She spoke no English beyond a few carefully memorized phrases, her native Polish words locked behind lips that had learned. Silence meant survival during her years in the Chicago tenements. What she discovered in this dying town would force her to find her voice in ways she never imagined. Because the children weren't just cursed, they were calling for help in a language only she could understand. The letter from Thomas Hartwell had been simple, almost crude in its directness. Need wife, good man, pay travel, small town Kansas. Work hard together. The envelope had contained train fare and an address that led Sarah across half the continent to escape circumstances that had left her with no other choice but to trust a stranger's promises. At 28, Sarah Kowalski had survived things that should have killed her twice over. The factory fire in Chicago that claimed her sister and left her with burn scars along her right arm. The typhoid outbreak in the Polish district that took her parents within the same week. The economic depression that closed the textile mills where she had learned to speak broken English while working. 18-hour shifts for wages that barely covered rent in a boarding house room she shared with 3 other immigrant women, but survival had come at a cost that extended beyond physical scars or financial desperation. Sarah had learned to make herself invisible, to speak only when spoken to trust no one completely, because trust was a luxury that poor immigrant women couldn't afford. The skills that had kept her alive in Chicago's brutal industrial landscape had also isolated her from human connection in ways that made Thomas Hartwell's marriage proposal seem like salvation. Despite the obvious risks, the journey from Chicago to Kansas had taken 4 days on trains that grew progressively smaller and less comfortable as she traveled, further from civilization's centers toward frontier communities that existed on the edges of everything familiar. Each mile carried her further from the world where Polish was spoken in homes and shops, where Catholic masses were conducted in Latin she could follow, where being foreign meant joining a community of people who shared similar struggles with language and belonging. Millfield represented complete cultural isolation, a place where Sarah's foreignness would mark her as fundamentally different from everyone she encountered, but it also represented the possibility of starting over without the weight of accumulated tragedies that had defined her Chicago existence. The town that greeted Sarah's arrival defied every expectation. She had formed based on Thomas Hartwell's letters. Instead of the thriving agricultural community he had described, she found a place that seemed to be dying from some inexplicable plague that affected only the youngest residents. Millfield's main street, which should have bustled with the activity of harvest season, lay nearly deserted, except for a few adults who moved through their daily routines with the mechanical precision of people going through motions while their hearts remained focused elsewhere. Shop windows displayed goods that no one seemed interested in purchasing. The church bells that should have called families to Sunday services rang over empty pews where parents sat alone, their children too ill to attend worship. Most disturbing of all were the sounds that emerged from residential neighborhoods during evening hours. Not just crying, but vocalizations that didn't sound entirely human, keening wails that rose and fell in patterns that suggested communication rather than simple distress. Thomas Hartwell met Sarah at Millfield's single-platform train station with an expression that revealed how completely his circumstances had changed since their correspondence began. At 42, he possessed the weathered features of someone who had spent decades working outdoors, but his eyes carried a haunted quality that spoke of recent trauma rather than accumulated hardship. "Miss Kowalski," he said, removing his hat with formal courtesy that couldn't disguise his obvious anxiety. "I need to be honest with you about situations that weren't fully explained in my letters." The confession that followed revealed deceptions that went far beyond simple omissions about local conditions. Thomas Hartwell wasn't just seeking a wife to help manage household duties on a successful farm. He was desperately searching for someone who might possess knowledge or capabilities that could address a crisis that had already claimed 3 children's lives and threatened to destroy every family in Millfield. The children started getting sick 6 months ago, Thomas explained as he led Sarah through streets that seemed to grow quieter with each block they traversed. Not sick like fever or consumption. Sick in ways that don't make sense to anyone who's tried to help them. The symptoms he described challenged everything Sarah thought she understood about childhood illnesses. Previously healthy children had begun experiencing episodes where they spoke in rapid, fluent languages that linguists from the University of Kansas couldn't identify. During these episodes, the children displayed knowledge about historical events, geographic locations, and cultural practices that they had never been exposed to through education or family experience. Between episodes, the affected children grew progressively weaker, losing weight and vitality despite consuming normal amounts of food and receiving attentive medical care. 3 had already died after weeks of decline that followed no recognizable pattern of disease progression. Dr. Morrison came from Topeka. Thomas continued as they approached the boarding house where Sarah would stay until their marriage arrangements were finalized. Spent 2 weeks examining every child in town. Couldn't find any physical cause for their condition. Said it was probably some kind of group hysteria. But that doesn't explain why they're actually dying. The medical assessment that dismissed the children's condition as psychological rather than physical reflected broader attitudes about frontier medicine that often attributed unexplained phenomena to mental weakness rather than investigating underlying causes that might require specialized knowledge or unconventional approaches. But Sarah's experience surviving in Chicago's immigrant communities had taught her that mainstream medical practitioners often failed to recognize or address conditions that affected populations whose experiences didn't match standard assumptions about health, disease, and normal human behavior. The boarding house where Thomas arranged for Sarah's temporary accommodation provided her first direct exposure to the crisis that had transformed Millfield from thriving agricultural community into something resembling a town under siege by forces that no one could identify or combat. Effectively, Mrs. Elizabeth Gardner, the boarding house proprietress, was a woman in her 50s whose matter-of-fact demeanor couldn't entirely disguise the fear that had become a constant presence in her daily routine. While showing Sarah to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor, she provided details about the children's condition that revealed the full scope of what Sarah had unknowingly agreed to. It started with the Morrison boy, Mrs. Gardner explained as she arranged fresh linens on Sarah's bed. 8 years old, healthy as a horse one day, speaking perfect French the next morning like he'd been born in Paris. But not just speaking it, knowing things about French history and culture that no child in Kansas should know. The progression of symptoms that followed had established a pattern that affected children throughout Millfield with disturbing consistency. The initial language episodes were followed by periods of exhaustion that left the children barely able to participate in normal activities. Physical symptoms included loss of appetite, sleep disturbances, and a pale complexion that made them appear years older than their actual ages. Most troubling were the children's reports of dreams or visions that seemed to involve experiences from lives they had never lived. They described detailed memories of places they had never visited, people they had never met, and events that had occurred decades or centuries before their births. Little Amy Patterson talks about working in cotton fields during slavery times, Mrs. Gardner continued. Her voice dropping to a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might somehow worsen the children's condition. Describes the overseer's whip and the taste of cornbread like she lived through it herself. That child has never been further than Topeka in her entire life. The scope of the crisis extended beyond individual cases to encompass nearly every family in Millfield. 17 children between the ages of 5 and 14 had been affected, with new cases appearing every few weeks despite parents' desperate attempts to isolate their families from whatever was causing the mysterious illness. Local religious leaders had attempted to address the situation through prayer services and spiritual counseling, but their efforts had produced no improvement in the children's condition. The Methodist minister had even requested assistance from church authorities in Wichita, but the specialists who traveled to Millfield had been unable to provide explanations or treatments that proved effective. Pastor Williams thinks it might be some kind of spiritual attack, Mrs. Gardner said as she finished arranging Sarah's accommodations. Wants to organize prayer vigils and fasting to drive out whatever evil has taken hold of our children. But I don't know if prayer is going to be enough if we don't understand what we're fighting against. The religious interpretation of the children's condition reflected one of several competing theories that had emerged among Millfield's adult population as they struggled to comprehend events that defied conventional understanding. Some residents believed the illness represented divine punishment for unspecified community sins. Others suspected contamination from industrial chemicals or agricultural pesticides that had somehow affected the local water supply. A few had proposed more exotic explanations involving spiritual possession, hereditary curses, or exposure to Native American burial grounds that might have been disturbed during recent construction projects. But none of these theories had led to treatments that produced measurable improvements in the children's condition. Sarah's first night in Millfield provided her with direct exposure to the sounds that had transformed the town's evening routine from peaceful family time into hours of desperate anxiety. For every parent whose child had been affected by the mysterious illness, the screaming that had awakened her at 3:17 a.m. wasn't random noise or simple distress calling. As Sarah listened from her boarding house window, she began to recognize patterns in the vocalizations that suggested structure and meaning rather than chaotic suffering. The children were speaking, but not in English or any European language Sarah had encountered during her years in Chicago's multicultural neighborhoods. The sounds carried tonal qualities that reminded her of musical scales, with rising and falling patterns that seemed to repeat in cycles that lasted several minutes before beginning again. But underneath the unfamiliar linguistic elements, Sarah detected something that made her heart race with recognition and terror. The emotional content of the children's vocalizations carried desperation and pleading that transcended language barriers, communicating needs that went beyond physical comfort or parental reassurance. These children were asking for help with something that required more than medical treatment or spiritual intervention. They were calling for someone who could understand what they were experiencing and provide assistance that addressed the actual cause of their suffering rather than just its visible symptoms. As dawn approached and the children's voices gradually quieted, Sarah realized that Thomas Hartwell's marriage proposal had brought her to a place where her survival skills would be tested in ways she had never anticipated. The isolation and cultural barriers that had made Millfield seem like refuge from Chicago's. Dangers were about to become the foundation for challenges that would require her to find capabilities she didn't know she possessed. The mail order bride who spoke no English was about to discover that healing cursed. Children required more than language. It required the courage to hear what they were really saying when conventional words failed to express the truth about their condition. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah's introduction to the afflicted children of Millfield came sooner than anyone expected. The morning after her arrival, while Thomas Hartwell was arranging their marriage license at the courthouse, a commotion outside the boarding house drew her to the front window, where she witnessed something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. 7-year-old Benjamin Walker was convulsing in the middle of Main Street, his small body rigid with unnatural tension, while words poured from his lips in a language that seemed to originate from somewhere far older than Kansas farmland. But Sarah recognized fragments of what the boy was saying, not the language itself, but the desperate emotion behind syllables that carried the weight of ancient grief. The child was speaking about fire, about loss, about searching for family members who would never be found. And somehow, impossibly, Sarah understood that Benjamin Walker was channeling memories that belonged to someone who had lived and died long before the boy's birth. Mrs. Margaret Walker, Benjamin's mother, knelt beside her son in the dust, tears streaming down her weathered face as she tried to comfort a child who no longer seemed to recognize her presence. The other townspeople who had gathered maintained a respectful distance, their expressions mixing sympathy with the kind of fear that came from witnessing events that challenged everything they thought they knew about the natural world. "He's been like this for 20 minutes, whispered Dr. James Morrison, the local physician whose medical training had proven useless against the children's mysterious condition. "Started right after breakfast, same as always. He'll speak in that unknown tongue for another hour, then collapse into sleep so deep we can barely wake him." But Sarah saw something the others missed. Benjamin's hand movements weren't random spasms. They were deliberate gestures that accompanied his vocalizations, creating patterns that suggested he was trying to communicate specific information rather than simply expressing distress. Without fully understanding her own motivations, Sarah descended from her second-floor window to the street below. The gathered townspeople parted to allow her approach, their curiosity about the foreign woman temporarily overriding their focus on Benjamin's episode. Kneeling beside Mrs. Walker, Sarah placed her scarred right hand gently on Benjamin's forehead. The contact produced an immediate change in the boy's condition that shocked everyone present into complete silence. Benjamin's rigid convulsions softened into relaxed breathing. The unintelligible torrent of words slowed to coherent phrases that Sarah could follow, even though she had never heard this particular language before. Most remarkably, the boy's eyes focused on Sarah's face with recognition that suggested he had been waiting for her arrival. "Matka," Benjamin whispered, using the Polish word for mother, though no one in Millfield would have taught him that term. "Pomóż nam, matka. Jesteśmy zagubieni. Help us, mother. We are lost." The crowd's reaction to hearing their afflicted child speak Polish to a foreign woman ranged from amazement to suspicion. Some interpreted the interaction as evidence that Sarah possessed healing abilities that could address their children's condition. Others worried that her presence somehow intensified the supernatural forces that were destroying their families. But Mrs. Walker's response was immediate and desperate. Grasping Sarah's arm with both hands, she pleaded in English that Sarah didn't fully comprehend, but understood through the universal language of maternal desperation. "Please," Margaret Walker said, her voice breaking with exhaustion from months of watching her son suffer. "If you can understand what he's saying, if you can help him, I'll do anything. We all will. These children are dying, and no one can tell us why." Sarah's limited English prevented her from explaining the complex impression she was receiving through her contact with Benjamin. The boy wasn't just speaking Polish, he was channeling the experiences of someone who had lived through specific historical events that had left traumatic imprints on locations or objects that somehow connected to Millfield's current situation through broken English supplemented by gestures and drawings. Sarah attempted to communicate her understanding that the children weren't possessed by evil spirits or suffering from mysterious diseases. They were experiencing what she could only describe as memory bleeding, involuntary access to traumatic experiences that had occurred in connection with places, objects, or bloodlines that linked past suffering to present circumstances. Her grandmother in Poland had described similar phenomena affecting families who lived in houses where terrible things had happened, or communities built on sites where mass tragedies had occurred. The old woman had called it pamięć ziemi, memory, of the earth, and had taught Sarah techniques for helping affected individuals process and release these inherited traumas. But applying those techniques in Millfield would require Sarah to overcome language barriers while gaining the trust of a community that was already stretched to its breaking point by months of watching their children suffer without explanation or effective treatment. Thomas Hartwell's return from the courthouse revealed the complexity of Sarah's situation within Millfield's social structure. As her husband-to-be, he possessed certain authority to speak on her behalf and facilitate her integration into community life. But his own reputation had been affected by his decision to import a foreign bride during a crisis that many townspeople interpreted as divine punishment for moral failures. "People are talking," Thomas admitted as he and Sarah walked toward his farm on the outskirts of town. "Some think bringing an outsider here during these troubles shows poor judgment. Others are wondering if your arrival might be connected to the children's condition getting worse. The suspicion that Sarah's presence might be exacerbating the supernatural crisis rather than offering solutions reflected deeper anxieties about foreigners, cultural contamination, and religious orthodoxy that were common in isolated frontier communities. Her Polish background, Catholic faith, and inability to communicate in fluent English marked her as fundamentally different from Millfield's established population. But Thomas had witnessed Sarah's interaction with Benjamin Walker, and his practical farmer's mind recognized that results mattered more than local prejudices when children's lives were at stake. "What I saw this morning," Thomas continued as they approached his modest farmhouse, "was the first time in 6 months that any of these children responded positively to adult intervention. If you can help them, I don't care what language you speak or where you come from." Sarah's examination of Thomas's property revealed environmental factors that might contribute to understanding the children's condition. The farmhouse had been built on land that showed evidence of previous settlement, foundation stones that were older and more weathered than the current structure, suggesting that other families had lived and possibly died on this site. More significantly, Sarah's grandmother had taught her to recognize signs of disturbed ground areas where traumatic events had occurred with sufficient intensity to leave lasting imprints that could affect sensitive individuals, particularly children whose natural psychic boundaries were less developed than those of adults. The symptoms she observed around Thomas's property included patches of ground where vegetation grew differently than in surrounding areas, subtle temperature variations that couldn't be explained by topography or sun exposure, and an overall atmospheric quality that made her feel unsettled in ways that reminded her of places in Poland where her grandmother had warned her never to linger after dark. That evening, Sarah's second night in Millfield brought more direct contact with the children's supernatural experiences. Instead of remaining in her boarding house room during the 3:17 a.m. episodes, she ventured into the residential neighborhoods, where affected families struggled through another night of unexplained suffering. What she discovered challenged every assumption about the nature of the children's condition. The afflicted youngsters weren't randomly distributed throughout the town. They were concentrated in specific areas that corresponded to locations Sarah's trained sensitivity could identify as sites of previous trauma or tragedy. Walking through Millfields streets during the darkest hours before dawn, Sarah encountered 12-year-old Emily Foster standing motionless in her family's front yard, speaking fluent Spanish while tears streamed down her face. The girl was describing events from what appeared to be the Mexican-American War, providing detailed accounts of battles and casualties that no Kansas farm child should have been able to access. But Emily's Spanish wasn't academic language learned from textbooks. It was the colloquial dialect of someone who had lived through specific experiences, complete with regional pronunciations and cultural references that suggested first-hand knowledge of historical events that had occurred decades before the girl's birth. Sarah's approach to Emily produced the same calming effect she had observed with Benjamin Walker. The child's rigid stance relaxed, and her historical narration shifted to direct communication with Sarah using a mixture of Spanish and Polish that should have been impossible for either of them to understand. Las voces no se callan. Matka, Emily whispered, combining Spanish and Polish in ways that transcended normal linguistic boundaries. Están atrapadas aquí, y nosotros también. The voices won't quiet, Mother. They are trapped here, and so are we. The revelation that emerged through Emily's multilingual communication provided Sarah with crucial insights into the actual cause of the children's condition. The affected youngsters weren't being possessed by malevolent spirits or suffering from medical diseases. They were serving as involuntary channels for traumatic memories that had become embedded in Millfield's physical environment. Through events that had occurred long before the town's current residents arrived, someone had died violently on the land where Millfield now stood. Multiple someones, actually, based on the diversity of languages and historical periods the children were accessing. And the psychic imprints of those deaths were strong enough to overwhelm sensitive individuals who lacked the knowledge or techniques necessary to protect themselves from unwanted spiritual contact. Sarah's grandmother had encountered similar situations in Poland, where ancient battlefields or sites of mass tragedy continued to affect living populations decades or centuries after the original events. The old woman's techniques for clearing such locations required specific knowledge of herbal preparations, ritual procedures, and protective practices that could help trapped spirits find peace while shielding living individuals from continued psychic intrusion. But adapting those traditional methods to Millfield's situation would require Sarah to overcome not just language barriers, but cultural and religious resistance from a Protestant community that viewed most supernatural interventions as potentially dangerous dabbling in forbidden practices. The following morning brought Sarah's first formal meeting with Millfield's community leaders, who had requested Thomas Hartwell to arrange a discussion about his foreign bride's apparent ability to communicate with the afflicted children. The gathering in Pastor Williams's church included the town's most influential residents, the pastor himself, Dr. Morrison, Mayor Robert Patterson, and several prominent farmers whose children had been affected by the mysterious condition. The conversation that followed revealed the complex social dynamics that would determine whether Sarah's potential interventions would be permitted or prohibited by community authorities who possessed the power to support or sabotage any efforts to address the children's supernatural crisis. Pastor Williams opened the discussion with careful diplomacy that couldn't entirely disguise his theological concerns about Sarah's abilities. Mrs. Kowalski, we've heard reports about your interactions with Benjamin Walker and Emily Foster. While we're grateful for any improvement in their conditions, some of our congregation have expressed concerns about the nature of these interventions. The religious objections to Sarah's methods reflected Protestant suspicions about Catholic practices, foreign spiritual traditions, and any supernatural activities that weren't explicitly sanctioned by established church doctrine. From Pastor Williams's perspective, the children's condition might represent divine testing that required prayer and faith rather than interventions that could be interpreted as occult practices. Dr. Morrison's medical concerns focused on different issues. As the only trained physician within 50 miles of Millfield, he felt responsible for ensuring that any treatments offered to the children met basic standards of safety and effectiveness, even if those treatments fell outside conventional medical practice. "I've observed Sarah's effect on 2 children," Dr. Morrison said, addressing his comments to Thomas rather than Sarah herself, whose limited English prevented her from following complex discussions. "Both showed immediate improvements that I can't explain through medical science. But I need to understand what she's actually doing before I can endorse treatments that might have unexpected consequences." Mayor Patterson's concerns were primarily practical and political. The crisis affecting Millfield's children had already damaged the town's reputation throughout the region, making it difficult to attract new families or businesses that were essential for economic survival. Any resolution to the supernatural crisis needed to restore community stability while avoiding actions that might create additional problems or controversies. "We need these children healthy and normal," Patterson stated bluntly. "If this woman can help them, we support whatever she needs to do. But we can't afford solutions that create new problems or drive away the families who haven't been affected yet." Thomas Hartwell's response to these concerns revealed his growing understanding of Sarah's actual capabilities and his willingness to advocate for approaches that prioritized results over community comfort or conventional expectations. "Gentlemen," Thomas said, speaking with authority that surprised Sarah with its firmness, "for 6 months, we've watched our children suffer while prayer, medicine, and every other intervention we've tried has failed to help them. In 2 days, Sarah has communicated with these children and provided them with more relief than anything else we've attempted." His argument for supporting Sarah's methods emphasized practical outcomes rather than theoretical concerns about religious orthodoxy or medical protocols. The children were dying. Conventional approaches had failed. Sarah offered hope that no other intervention had been able to provide. The decision reached by Millfield's leadership was cautious but supportive. Sarah would be permitted to work with the afflicted children under supervised conditions that ensured community oversight, while allowing her to apply whatever techniques she believed might be effective. But the real test of her abilities would come when she attempted to address the underlying cause of the children's condition, rather than just providing temporary relief from its symptoms. And that would require her to convince an entire community to participate in procedures that challenged their most fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality, death, and the relationship between the living and the dead. The first clue came from an unexpected source: the town's cemetery records, discovered by accident when Sarah accompanied Thomas to register their marriage at the courthouse. While Thomas completed paperwork with County Clerk Harold Morrison, Sarah's attention was drawn to a shelf of leather-bound volumes that contained burial records dating back to Millfield's founding in 1867. Her limited literacy in English couldn't fully decipher the handwritten entries, but names and dates revealed patterns that sent chills down her spine. Between 1871 and 1873, 17 people with Spanish surnames had been buried in unmarked graves on the outskirts of the official cemetery. The death certificates, where they existed, listed causes of death as fever or accident. But the clustering of deaths within such a short time frame suggested something far more sinister than natural causes. Sarah's hands trembled as she copied the names into her small notebook. Rodriguez, Morales, Castillo, Herrera. These weren't random settlers who had died from frontier hardships. These were families, entire bloodlines that had been wiped out within a 2-year period and buried without proper markers or recognition. When she attempted to communicate her discovery to Thomas through broken English and desperate gestures, His reaction revealed that he knew more about Millfield's history than he had previously disclosed. The expression that crossed his weathered features wasn't surprise. It was the guilty recognition of someone who had hoped buried secrets would remain buried. "Sarah," Thomas said, glancing around the courthouse to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "There are things about this town's history that most folks prefer not to discuss. Things that happened before the current families arrived, when this area was still disputed territory between Kansas. Settlers and Mexican land grants." The story, Thomas reluctantly shared, painted Millfield's founding in a light that contradicted the heroic pioneer narratives proudly displayed in the town's Historical Society Museum. The land where Millfield now stood hadn't been empty prairie waiting for American settlement. It had been occupied by Mexican families who possessed legal claims to thousands of acres granted by the Spanish crown. Decades before Kansas achieved territorial status, when American settlers arrived in the late 1860s, they found established ranches with irrigation systems, crop cultivation, and livestock operations that had been successfully operating for over a generation. Rather than negotiating fair compensation or recognizing existing property rights, the settlers had organized what they euphemistically called claim disputes to forcibly remove the Mexican families from land they wanted for themselves. "It wasn't supposed to be violent," Thomas said, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone reciting rationalizations he had never fully believed. "The idea was to pressure them into selling their claims and moving south where they could start over. But some of the Mexican families refused to leave, and some of the settlers got impatient with legal procedures. The violence that followed had been swift, brutal, and systematically covered up by community leaders who understood that territorial authorities might investigate if too many details became public knowledge. Entire families had been killed during night raids disguised as Indian attacks. Others had been poisoned or burned out of their homes, then buried in unmarked graves while their property was distributed among American settlers who claimed ignorance about the previous owner's fate. The 17 names Sarah had discovered in the burial records represented only the victims whose deaths had been officially recorded. Thomas estimated that at least twice that number had been murdered and buried without any documentation, their bodies hidden in unmarked locations throughout the area that would become Millfield. "My father was one of the settlers who participated," Thomas admitted, meeting Sarah's horrified gaze with difficulty. "He got his original land grant through what happened to the Herrera family. 5 people killed for 300 acres that my family has been farming ever since." The revelation transformed Sarah's understanding of the supernatural crisis affecting Millfield's children. These weren't random spiritual disturbances or mysterious medical conditions. The afflicted children were channeling the traumatic final experiences of murdered families, whose deaths had never been acknowledged, investigated, or properly mourned. The Spanish that Emily Foster spoke during her episodes wasn't academic language. It was the desperate final words of people who had died violently and unjustly, their spirits unable to find peace because their murders had been covered up and forgotten by the community that had profited from their deaths. Benjamin Walker's Polish communications weren't evidence of supernatural possession. They were Sarah's own inherited sensitivity, allowing her to bridge the linguistic gap between the trapped spirits and their unwilling child mediums, translating desperate pleas for justice and recognition across cultural and temporal boundaries. But understanding the cause of the children's condition was only the first step toward addressing it. The spiritual traditions Sarah had learned from her grandmother required specific procedures for helping murdered souls find peace, and those procedures couldn't be completed without community acknowledgement of the injustices that had created the supernatural crisis. Sarah's attempt to explain this to Thomas revealed the complexity of seeking justice for historical crimes when the descendants of both victims and perpetrators still lived in the same geographical area Every family in Millfield had benefited from the land acquisitions that resulted from the massacres. Their farms, businesses, and community institutions had been built on property obtained through murder and theft. Acknowledging the truth about Millfield's founding would require more than historical curiosity or academic interest. It would demand moral reckoning with inherited guilt and practical decisions about how to address ongoing injustices that continued to generate supernatural consequences. "You're asking me to destroy my community," Thomas said, after Sarah had managed to communicate the scope of what would be required to heal the children. "If we admit what really happened here, we'll face legal challenges, property disputes, and probably federal investigation of territorial land grants. Every family in town will lose everything they've built over 25 years. The moral complexity of the situation challenged Sarah's own assumptions about justice, responsibility, and the relationship between past crimes and present consequences. The children who were suffering hadn't participated in the historical murders. The current residents of Millfield had inherited their property through normal legal transfers, unaware that their land titles were based on documented murders. But the spiritual laws that governed interactions between the living and the dead operated according to different principles than human legal systems. The murdered Mexican families couldn't find peace until their deaths were acknowledged and their killers faced consequences. The children couldn't recover until the community that had benefited from those deaths took responsibility for addressing the ongoing spiritual crisis their silence had created. Sarah's decision to proceed with the healing rituals, despite Thomas's objections, reflected her growing understanding that some moral obligations transcended personal comfort or community convenience. The children were dying because adults had chosen to prioritize their own interests over justice for murder victims. Continuing to ignore the spiritual consequences of those choices would result in more deaths and greater suffering. The preparations Sarah began for the cleansing ceremonies required materials and knowledge that challenged her resourcefulness in ways that survival in Chicago's industrial slums had never demanded. The herbal components she needed for protective and purification preparations weren't available from local suppliers, requiring her to identify native plants that could substitute for European species her grandmother had used in similar situations. More challenging was the need to create physical representations of the murdered families that would enable their spirits to communicate directly with the living community rather than only through the involuntary child mediums who were being damaged by sustained spiritual contact. Sarah's exploration of the areas where the Mexican families had been buried revealed environmental evidence that confirmed Thomas's historical account. The unmarked burial sites were identifiable by vegetation patterns that reflected changes in soil composition where bodies had been interred without proper preparation or ceremony. But the sites also revealed artifacts that provided crucial information about the identities and lives of the murdered families. Personal items that had been buried with the bodies, jewelry, religious medals, tools, and children's toys offered insights into individual personalities and family relationships that would be essential for conducting effective spiritual communications. The most significant discovery came when Sarah found the remains of what had been the Herrera family chapel, a small stone structure where the Mexican families had conducted religious services before American settlers arrived. The building had been deliberately destroyed during the massacres, but its foundation stones remained embedded in ground that still carried the spiritual resonance of prayers and sacred rituals that had sanctified the location. Sarah's grandmother had taught her that sites where people had regularly communicated with the divine retained spiritual power that could be accessed by individuals who understood proper protocols for sacred interaction. The ruined chapel represented a potential bridge between the murdered families and the living community that could facilitate healing for both the trapped spirits and the afflicted children. But utilizing the chapel's spiritual resources would require Sarah to conduct ceremonies that challenged Millfield's Protestant religious sensibilities, while demanding community participation in activities that many residents would view as foreign, dangerous, or blasphemous. The confrontation that followed Sarah's discovery of the chapel site brought the town's underlying tensions to a crisis point that would determine whether healing was possible or whether the supernatural crisis would continue to claim more lives. Pastor Williams's reaction to Sarah's request for permission to conduct cleansing ceremonies at the ruined chapel reflected theological concerns that went beyond simple Protestant Catholic differences to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of spiritual authority and proper responses to supernatural phenomena. Mrs. Hartwell, the pastor said, using Sarah's married name for the first time to emphasize her new status within the community hierarchy. What you're proposing sounds dangerously close to necromancy, communication with the dead that Scripture explicitly forbids. Our congregation can't participate in rituals that might jeopardize their souls, to address problems that should be resolved through prayer and faith. Dr. Morrison's medical objections focused on different concerns. His scientific training made him skeptical of any treatments that couldn't be explained through established medical principles, even when those treatments produced observable improvements in patient conditions. I've seen Sarah's calming effect on the affected children, Dr. Morrison acknowledged, but I can't endorse community participation in ceremonies that might be based on superstition rather than genuine therapeutic intervention. If these rituals fail to produce lasting improvements, we could face psychological damage to participants who trusted in false hope. Mayor Patterson's political concerns reflected his responsibility for maintaining community stability and economic viability during a crisis that had already damaged Millfield's regional reputation. His support for any proposed solution would depend on its potential to restore normalcy without creating additional controversies that might drive away current residents or discourage new settlement. We need solutions that end this crisis permanently, Mayor Patterson stated. If Sarah's ceremonies can heal these children and restore normal life to our community, I'll support whatever she needs to do. But we can't afford interventions that create new problems or fail to address the underlying causes of these supernatural disturbances. The debate that followed revealed deep divisions within Millfield's leadership about the relationship between spiritual and practical concerns, individual welfare versus community stability, and the appropriate response to supernatural phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of reality. Sarah's limited English prevented her from participating directly in these discussions, but her observation of the adults' body language and emotional responses provided insights into community dynamics that would influence whether her healing work would be permitted or prohibited. Thomas Hartwell's advocacy for Sarah's methods had evolved from cautious support to determined defense of her abilities and the necessity of addressing the historical injustices that were causing the children's suffering. His growing understanding of the spiritual principles underlying her work had convinced him that half measures or compromises wouldn't resolve the supernatural crisis that was destroying his community. "Gentlemen," Thomas said, addressing the assembled community leaders with authority that reflected his status as one of Millfield's most successful farmers. "We've tried prayer, medicine, and every conventional approach to helping these children. Nothing has worked. Sarah offers the only hope we've seen in 6 months of watching our children die from causes no one can explain or treat." The decision reached by Millfield's leadership represented a compromise that satisfied no one completely. but provided Sarah with sufficient authority to attempt the cleansing ceremonies while maintaining enough community oversight to address religious and practical concerns about her methods. Sarah would be permitted to conduct her rituals at the ruined chapel site, but only with direct supervision from Pastor Williams and Dr. Morrison. Community participation would be voluntary, but she would have access to any materials or assistance that participants were willing to provide. Most importantly, the ceremonies would be conducted as a single, comprehensive intervention rather than extended spiritual work that might create ongoing supernatural disturbances or religious controversies within the community. The preparations that followed would test not only Sarah's spiritual knowledge and healing abilities, but her capacity to bridge cultural differences and overcome language barriers to unite a fractured community around shared recognition of historical injustices and collective responsibility for addressing their ongoing consequences. The night before the cleansing ceremony, Millfield transformed into a town divided against itself. While Sarah prepared sacred materials in the solitude of the ruined chapel, families throughout the community argued behind closed doors about whether to participate in rituals that could either save their children or damn their souls, depending on which authority they chose to believe. Catherine Mills, whose 9-year-old daughter Jessica had been speaking ancient Greek for 3 weeks while describing battles from the Peloponnesian War, stood in her kitchen at midnight, grinding herbs that Sarah had requested for protective preparations. The aromatic mixture of sage, cedar, and prairie sweetgrass filled her modest home with scents that reminded her of her grandmother's Cherokee heritage, traditions she had abandoned. When she married into Millfield's white farming community, maybe the foreign woman knows something we've forgotten. Catherine whispered to her husband Robert as she worked. Maybe there are older ways of healing that don't come from church doctrine or medical schools. 3 houses down, banker William Foster paced his front parlor, while his wife Margaret packed belongings for a hasty departure to her sister's home in Topeka. William had refused to allow his family to participate in what he called pagan rituals conducted by an ignorant immigrant, and he was prepared to abandon his business interests rather than expose his children to supernatural influences he couldn't understand or control. That Polish woman is practicing witchcraft, William declared to anyone who would listen. Mark my words, her ceremonies will make this situation worse, not better. We should have sent for a proper exorcist from Wichita instead of trusting our children's welfare to someone who can barely speak English. The ideological battle lines that emerged revealed deeper cultural tensions that had always existed beneath Millfield's surface harmony. Families with any Native American heritage found themselves drawn to Sarah's earth-based spiritual approach, recognizing elements that resonated with suppressed tribal memories about proper relationships between the living and the dead. Recent immigrants from European countries where folk healing traditions remained strong expressed cautious support for methods that reminded them of practices their own grandmothers had used to address supernatural disturbances. These families understood that the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was more porous than American Protestant doctrine typically acknowledged, but long-time residents whose identities were firmly rooted in conventional Christianity viewed Sarah's proposed ceremonies as threats to everything they believed about proper spiritual authority and acceptable religious practice. For them, addressing supernatural problems through any means other than prayer and biblical faith represented dangerous compromise with forces that could destroy both individual souls and community moral foundations. Sarah spent the pre-ceremony hours in the ruins of the Herrera family chapel. Surrounded by artifacts she had recovered from unmarked graves and materials she had gathered for the ritual cleansing. Her grandmother's training had included extensive instruction about the emotional and spiritual preparation required for communicating with traumatized spirits. But nothing in that education had prepared her for the complexity of addressing murders that had been systematically covered up by an entire community. The personal items recovered from the burial sites told stories of interrupted lives that made the magnitude of Millfield's founding crimes emotionally overwhelming. Children's toys carved from wood suggested families with young ones who had died alongside their parents. Religious medals indicated deep Catholic faith that had provided no protection against Protestant settlers' violence. Wedding rings and jewelry revealed love relationships that had been destroyed by hatred and greed. But the most disturbing discoveries were documents that had been buried with some of the victims. Land grants, property deeds, and business records that proved the Mexican families had possessed legitimate legal claims to thousands of acres that American settlers had stolen through murder. These weren't squatters or trespassers who'd been forcibly removed from disputed territory. These were legal property owners who had been killed by thieves, who then forged documentation to support their fraudulent land. Claims. Sarah's limited English prevented her from fully understanding the legal implications of these documents, but she recognized that their existence could expose current Millfield residents to criminal prosecution and civil lawsuits that would destroy the community's economic foundation. The choice to proceed with ceremonies that might bring this evidence to public attention represented a decision to prioritize spiritual justice over practical consequences that could ruin innocent families. The arrival of unexpected visitors on the morning of the ceremony added complications that threatened to transform Sarah's healing ritual into a public spectacle that could attract unwanted attention from territorial and federal authorities. A wagon train of 12 families had stopped in Millfield en route to California, their leader having heard rumors about supernatural disturbances affecting local children. Captain James Mitchell, the wagon train's elected leader, was a former Army officer whose experience with frontier conflicts had taught him to recognize signs of spiritual disturbance that conventional military training couldn't address. His Native American scout, a Kiowa man named Joseph Crow Feather, possessed traditional knowledge about cleansing ceremonies that could either support or challenge Sarah's planned rituals. "Ma'am," Captain Mitchell said, addressing Sarah through Thomas Hartwell as translator, "we've encountered situations like this before during our travels. Communities where violent deaths created spiritual problems that affected living populations. If you're planning to address those problems through traditional methods, we'd like to offer whatever assistance might be helpful." Joseph Crow Feathers' assessment of the supernatural crisis affecting Millfield's children provided external validation for Sarah's understanding of the situation while offering additional techniques that could strengthen her planned ceremonies. The Kiowa scout recognized the symptoms of ghost sickness, a condition that occurred when traumatized spirits remained earthbound instead of traveling to their proper spiritual destinations. "The children are carrying voices that don't belong to them," Joseph explained to Sarah through a combination of English, Spanish, and hand signs that transcended their linguistic differences. "The voices are trapped in this place by injustice that was never addressed. Until the injustice is acknowledged and the spirits are properly honored, the children will continue to suffer." The scouts' traditional knowledge complemented Sarah's grandmother's teachings while providing practical suggestions for ceremony modifications that could address the specific spiritual dynamics affecting Millfield. The combination of European folk healing traditions and Native American spiritual practices offered possibilities for more effective intervention than either approach could accomplish independently, but the presence of outsiders also increased the risk that word of Millfield's supernatural crisis would spread to communities and authorities who might investigate the historical crimes that had created the current situation. Captain Mitchell's wagon train included a territorial newspaper correspondent whose professional interest in unusual frontier stories could result in published accounts that would expose Millfield to unwanted scrutiny. Sarah's decision to proceed with the cleansing ceremony despite these risks reflected her growing understanding that half measures and compromises wouldn't resolve spiritual problems that demanded complete honesty about historical injustices. The murdered Mexican families deserved acknowledgement of their suffering and recognition of the crimes committed against them, regardless of the practical consequences that truth might create for current residents. The ceremony itself began at dawn in the ruins of the Herrera family chapel, with 17 members of the Millfield community joining Sarah in rituals that challenged every assumption they had made about proper spiritual practice and acceptable religious behavior. The participants included parents of afflicted children who were desperate enough to try anything, community members with suppressed ethnic heritage that resonated with Sarah's methods, and curious observers who wanted to witness supernatural phenomena firsthand. Pastor Williams attended as an official observer rather than participant, his theological concerns preventing full endorsement, while his pastoral responsibilities required him to monitor activities that involved members of his congregation. Dr. Morrison also maintained clinical distance, documenting the ceremony's effects on participating children while avoiding personal involvement in religious practices that fell outside his medical expertise. The ritual cleansing began with Sarah's creation of a sacred space using protective herbs and symbols that combined Polish folk traditions with elements adapted from Native American practices that Joseph Crow Feather had suggested. The result was a spiritual framework that honored multiple cultural approaches to supernatural healing, while addressing the specific needs of Millfield's trapped spirits. Working methodically through procedures her grandmother had taught her, Sarah began calling the names of the murdered Mexican families while displaying personal items that had been recovered from their unmarked graves. Each name spoken aloud was accompanied by acknowledgement of the violence that had ended their lives and recognition of the injustice that had prevented their spirits from finding peace. Maria Herrera, Sarah said, holding a small silver cross that had been buried with a young mother, murdered for her family's land, her children killed alongside her, their deaths hidden by lies that continue to poison this ground. The immediate response to these invocations exceeded anything Sarah had anticipated based on her grandmother's descriptions of similar ceremonies. The air around the ruined chapel began to shimmer with what appeared to be heat distortion, but the temperature remained cool despite bright morning sunlight. Participants reported hearing voices speaking in Spanish, though no living person present was producing those sounds. Most dramatically, the afflicted children who had accompanied their parents began responding to the ceremony with visible relief from symptoms that had tormented them for months. Benjamin Walker's rigid convulsions relaxed into normal movement. Emily Foster's desperate crying shifted to calm breathing. Jessica Mills stopped speaking ancient Greek and began communicating in clear English for the first time in weeks. But the ceremony also produced effects that challenged participants' emotional and spiritual capacity to process what they were witnessing. The spirits of the murdered families weren't just acknowledging the recognition they had waited decades to receive. They were demanding justice for crimes that had never been prosecuted and reparations for property that had been stolen through violence. The voice that emerged through Benjamin Walker's transformed state wasn't the boy's own speech. It was the clear, authoritative Spanish of a man who identified himself as Don Carlos Herrera, patriarch of the family that had owned the land where Millfield now stood. His demands were specific and non-negotiable: return of stolen property to his surviving descendants, prosecution of the families who had profited from murder, and public acknowledgement of the crimes that had been covered up for 25 years. Nuestra sangre grita desde la tierra, the spirit declared through Benjamin's voice, while the boy's eyes remained fixed on Sarah with supernatural intensity. Our blood cries out from the earth. Justice delayed is not justice denied. The children will continue to suffer until the living make amends for the sins of their fathers. The ultimatum delivered through the possessed child created an immediate crisis for ceremony participants who realized that healing the children would require more than spiritual cleansing. It would demand community-wide reckoning with historical crimes and practical decisions about how to address ongoing injustices that most residents had never even known existed. Sarah's attempt to negotiate with the spirits on behalf of Millfield's current residents revealed the complexity of seeking compromise between spiritual demands for absolute justice and practical limitations on what living communities could realistically accomplish without destroying themselves in the process. "The children are innocent," Sarah said, addressing the spirits in Polish while hoping her meaning would transcend language barriers. "The families living here now didn't commit these crimes. They've built their lives on this land through honest work. Surely there must be ways to honor your memory without destroying people who weren't responsible for your deaths." But Don Carlos Herrera's response, delivered through Benjamin Walker's increasingly strained voice, indicated that the spirit's concept of justice didn't recognize distinctions between individual guilt and collective responsibility. The community that had benefited from murder was accountable for addressing the consequences of those crimes, regardless of whether current residents had personally participated in the original violence. The ceremony that had begun as spiritual healing was transforming into supernatural tribunal, where the living were being held accountable for historical injustices by judges whose authority transcended earthly law and whose demands for retribution threatened to destroy everything that Millfield had built on the foundation of covered-up crimes. As the mourning progressed and the spirit's demands became more specific and more impossible to fulfill, Sarah realized that her healing ritual had opened a door that might prove impossible to close without consequences that would affect not just the afflicted children, but every family whose prosperity had been built on blood-soaked ground that the dead were no longer willing to sanctify through their silence. The supernatural confrontation that had begun as a healing ceremony descended into chaos when 12-year-old Amanda Crawford collapsed during the spirit's increasingly violent demands for justice. The girl had been channeling the voice of Isabella Morales, a young mother who had been burned alive while trying to protect her infant son, when the spiritual possession suddenly intensified beyond what her small body could endure. Amanda's convulsions were unlike anything Dr. Morrison had witnessed during his medical career. Her back arched impossibly, lifting her entire torso off the ground, while her limbs moved in patterns that defied normal human anatomy. The voice, emerging from her throat, carried such rage and anguish that several adult participants fled the ceremony, unable to withstand the emotional intensity of a murder victim's final moments being relived through a living child. "Venganza! Venganza por mis hijos!" the spirit screamed through Amanda's straining vocal cords. "Vengeance! Vengeance for my children!" The girl's eyes had rolled back until only the whites were visible, and blood began trickling from her nose, as the spiritual possession pushed her physical form beyond its limits. Sarah realized with growing horror that her attempt to facilitate healing communication between the living and the dead had instead opened a spiritual battleground where traumatized murder victims were using innocent children as weapons in their war against the community that had profited from their deaths. The immediate crisis required Sarah to make decisions that went far beyond her grandmother's traditional healing knowledge. The spirits weren't seeking peaceful resolution or mutual understanding. They wanted retribution that would satisfy decades of accumulated rage, even if pursuing that retribution killed the children who were serving as their unwilling mediums. Working frantically with materials from her ritual preparation, Sarah began constructing protective barriers around Amanda's convulsing form while chanting Polish incantations that she hoped would limit the spiritual possession without completely severing the connection that might be the only path to eventual resolution. But her efforts to moderate the supernatural confrontation were complicated by the fact that several ceremony participants had lost control of their own emotional responses to witnessing supernatural violence being channeled through their community's children. Margaret Walker Benjamin's mother began screaming at the empty air where she believed Don Carlos Herrera's spirit was manifesting. "Take me instead. Leave my son alone. He's done nothing to deserve this torture." Robert Mills grabbed his daughter, Jessica, and attempted to flee the ceremony. But the girl's body had become rigid with spiritual possession that prevented normal movement. When Robert tried to lift her, Jessica's voice began speaking in what sounded like ancient Latin, while her small hands clawed at her father's face with strength that exceeded normal childhood capabilities. The breakdown of organized ceremony procedures created multiple simultaneous spiritual crises that threatened to spiral beyond anyone's ability to control or contain. Children throughout the gathering were being simultaneously possessed by different murder victims, each spirit carrying individual trauma that demanded separate attention and specific forms of justice that conflicted with other spirits' equally legitimate claims. Captain Mitchell's military experience with battlefield chaos enabled him to recognize that the supernatural situation required immediate command structure and strategic withdrawal rather than continued attempts to negotiate with entities whose demands exceeded what living communities could practically fulfill. "Mrs. Hartwell," Mitchell shouted over the sounds of possessed children and panicking adults, "we need to end this ceremony now, before these children are permanently damaged by spiritual forces they can't survive." But Sarah's understanding of the spiritual dynamics involved indicated that abruptly terminating the ceremony without proper closure could trap the children in permanent possession states, while leaving the murder victims' spirits even more agitated and determined to seek violent revenge against the living community. The solution that emerged required Sarah to transform from facilitator of communication between living and dead into active mediator in a supernatural conflict where both sides possessed legitimate grievances but incompatible demands for resolution. "Enough," Sarah declared, speaking in Polish, while directing her words toward the spiritual presences that were tormenting the children. "You want justice, but you're destroying innocent lives to get it. These children aren't your enemies. They're victims of your pain, just as you were victims of violence and hatred." The response from the spirits revealed that their concept of justice had been corrupted by decades of rage and isolation into something that prioritized punishment over healing, vengeance over restoration of balance between the living and the dead. Don Carlos Herrera's voice, still emerging through Benjamin Walker's strained throat, carried contempt for Sarah's attempts to protect the community that had benefited from his family's murder. "You speak of innocence, Polish woman, but there is no innocence in prosperity built on blood. These children carry the sins of their fathers, and they will suffer until those sins are acknowledged and punished." The spiritual logic underlying the murder victim's position reflected concepts of collective responsibility and inherited guilt that transcended individual accountability. From their perspective, Millfield's current residents were accessories to historical crimes by virtue of their continued occupation of stolen land and their participation in community. Structures that had been built on the foundation of covered-up murders. But Sarah's experience, surviving personal trauma in Chicago, had taught her that healing required breaking cycles of violence rather than perpetuating them through endless retaliation. The spirit's demand for vengeance would create new victims while failing to address the underlying injustices that had created the supernatural crisis. "Your families deserve justice," Sarah said, maintaining her position between the possessing spirits and the afflicted children, while Joseph Crowfeather began adding his own protective chants to the increasingly complex spiritual dynamic. But justice that creates new suffering isn't justice at all. It's just more violence disguised as righteousness. The negotiation that followed tested Sarah's linguistic abilities, spiritual knowledge, and diplomatic skills in ways that no previous experience had prepared her to handle. She was simultaneously translating between multiple languages, mediating between competing spiritual entities, protecting children from supernatural forces that exceeded their physical capacity to survive, and attempting to find resolution paths that could satisfy both the living and the dead without destroying either community. The breakthrough came when Joseph Crowfeather recognized elements in the spirit's manifestations that connected to traditional Native American concepts of spiritual balance and restorative justice. The Kiowa Scouts' understanding of proper relationships between different worlds provided frameworks for negotiation that honored the murder victims' need for acknowledgement while establishing limits on their demands for retribution. The spirits speak truth about injustice, Joseph said, addressing both the supernatural entities and the living participants while maintaining the careful ritual postures that his tribal training had taught him for dangerous spiritual work. But they have forgotten wisdom about healing that goes beyond punishment. The children suffer because balance has been broken. Healing requires restoring balance, not creating more imbalance through revenge. The traditional Native American approach to addressing historical trauma offered possibilities for resolution that neither European folk healing nor Protestant Christianity had provided. Instead of focusing on individual guilt or supernatural punishment, Joseph's tribal knowledge emphasized community healing through acknowledgement of harm, appropriate compensation for damages, and restoration of proper spiritual relationships. Working together, Sarah and Joseph began restructuring the ceremony around principles of restorative rather than punitive justice. The murder victims would receive the acknowledgement and honor they deserved, but their demands for vengeance would be redirected toward constructive actions that could benefit both the living and the dead. The process required several hours of careful spiritual negotiation as each murdered family's representative agreed to modified terms for resolution. Don Carlos Herrera accepted community acknowledgement of his family's property rights and public recognition of the crimes committed against them, in exchange for releasing his demands for individual punishment of descendant families who had inherited stolen land through legal transfers. Isabella Morales agreed to end her possession of Amanda Crawford when the community committed to establishing a memorial that would ensure her children's deaths were never forgotten, while also funding educational programs that would teach future generations about the historical injustices that had shaped Millfield's development. One by one, the 17 murder victims negotiated spiritual contracts that provided them with recognition and honor while establishing sustainable paths forward for the living community that didn't require anyone's destruction or financial ruin. But the most difficult negotiation involved the spirits' demands for access to their descendants who might still be living in Mexico or other parts of the American Southwest. The murdered families wanted their surviving relatives to know what had happened to them and to receive compensation for the property that had been stolen through violence. This requirement would necessitate community leaders undertaking investigations and making contact with families who might not even know their ancestors had owned land in Kansas. It would also require legal procedures that could expose current residents to civil lawsuits and criminal prosecution for crimes committed by their predecessors. Mayor Patterson's response to this demand reflected the practical limitations the democratic communities faced when addressing historical injustices that had legal and financial implications. For current residents who had not personally participated in the original crimes. Mrs. Hartwell, Patterson said, speaking formally to emphasize the gravity of community decision-making that would affect every family in Millfield. What you're asking us to do could destroy this town economically and legally. We're willing to acknowledge historical injustices and honor the victims' memory, but we can't commit to actions that would bankrupt families who built their lives here through honest work. The compromise that emerged from these negotiations represented imperfect justice that prioritized healing over punishment while establishing sustainable frameworks for addressing historical trauma. The spirits would receive public acknowledgement, memorial recognition, and community commitment to truthful historical education. The living residents would retain their property while accepting moral responsibility for addressing ongoing consequences of their community's violent founding. Most importantly, the children would be released from their involuntary roles as spiritual mediums once the community completed its obligations to honor the murder victims and establish appropriate memorials that would provide the dead with permanent recognition of their suffering and loss. As the sun set over the ruins of the Herrera family chapel, the supernatural crisis that had terrorized Millfield for 6 months finally began to resolve into sustainable peace between the living and the dead. The children, who had been possessed by traumatized spirits, slowly returned to normal consciousness, their bodies exhausted, but no longer carrying the overwhelming burden of channeling other people's final moments. Sarah's role in facilitating this resolution had transformed her from desperate mail-order bride into recognized community leader whose abilities would be remembered long after the supernatural crisis had been forgotten by people who preferred not to discuss uncomfortable truths about their town's history. But the most profound change was in Sarah herself, who had discovered that her grandmother's traditional healing knowledge could address spiritual problems that transcended cultural boundaries when combined with courage to confront difficult truths and determination to seek justice that healed rather than destroyed. The woman who had arrived in Millfield speaking no English had found her voice by listening to voices that had been silenced for decades, and had saved 17 children by helping their entire community acknowledge that healing required honesty about the past, regardless of how uncomfortable that honesty might be for people who preferred simpler narratives about their history and identity. The weeks following the supernatural crisis revealed the true complexity of healing a community that had built its entire identity on carefully maintained lies. While the children recovered their normal health with remarkable speed, the adults of Millfield struggled to process the implications of what they had witnessed and promised. During the spiritual negotiations, Sarah found herself in the unprecedented position of serving as cultural translator, not just between languages, but between worldviews that had fundamentally different understandings of justice, responsibility, and the proper relationship between past and present. Her small farmhouse became an informal embassy where representatives from various factions within the community came to seek guidance about implementing the agreements they had made with the spirits of the murdered Mexican families. The first major challenge arose when territorial land office officials arrived from Topeka to investigate reports of irregularities in property deeds dating back to Millfield's founding. Word of the supernatural events had spread beyond the community, despite efforts to maintain privacy, and territorial authorities were now demanding explanations for documentation that appeared to show fraudulent land transfers covering thousands of acres. Land. Commissioner Herbert Morrison, Dr. Morrison's cousin from the territorial capital, brought with him 2 federal marshals and a clerk, whose job involved examining every property deed, surveyor's record, and legal transfer document that had established current ownership patterns throughout the Millfield district. Gentlemen, Commissioner Morrison announced during a mandatory community meeting held in the Methodist Church, we've received reports suggesting that significant portions of this township were acquired through irregular procedures that may have violated territorial law and federal statutes governing property rights in Kansas. The investigation that followed exposed the systematic nature of the crimes that had established Millfield. The fraudulent documentation that Thomas Hartwell's father and other original settlers had created to support their land claims revealed a conspiracy that had involved dozens of families working together to murder legitimate property owners and forge legal papers that would withstand casual inspection by distant territorial authorities. But the passage of 25 years had created legal complications that made prosecuting the historical crimes virtually impossible. Most of the original perpetrators had died, and their property had been transferred through numerous legitimate sales to current owners who had no knowledge of the criminal origins of their land titles. Federal Marshal William Grant's assessment of the situation reflected the practical limitations that legal systems faced when addressing historical injustices that had been effectively covered up for decades. What we have here, Marshal Grant explained to the assembled community, is clear evidence of multiple murders and systematic fraud that occurred in the 1870s. But the evidence was buried, literally and figuratively, in ways that make criminal prosecution extremely difficult under current territorial law. The legal resolution that emerged required Sarah to serve as intermediary between federal authorities and the spirits of the murdered families, translating not just languages, but entire conceptual frameworks about justice and compensation that had no precedent in American territorial law. Through a series of seances conducted under official supervision, the murder victims agreed to accept federal recognition of their property rights and financial compensation paid by territorial authorities, rather than pursuing civil litigation against current residents who had inherited stolen land through legitimate purchases. The arrangement satisfied the spirit's demands for acknowledgement while protecting current families from financial ruin. But it also required the community to accept public designation as a site of historical injustice that would be documented in territorial records and taught in regional schools as an example of frontier violence and its consequences. Sarah's role in these negotiations revealed capabilities that extended far beyond her grandmother's traditional healing knowledge. She had developed skills in diplomatic communication, legal interpretation, and cultural mediation that enabled her to bridge gaps between supernatural entities and federal bureaucrats who were equally foreign to most frontier communities. But the most significant challenge facing post-crisis Millfield involved rebuilding social relationships within a community where every family now knew uncomfortable truths about their neighbors' histories and their own inherited connections to historical crimes. The Watson family discovered that their prosperous grain operation had been built on land stolen from the Castillo family, whose 3 children had been murdered alongside their parents during the 1872 massacres. Eleanor Watson's response to learning this history reflected the moral complexity that many residents faced when confronting inherited guilt for crimes they hadn't personally committed. How do I tell my children that their inheritance is blood money? Eldinar asked Sarah during one of many private consultations that followed the public resolution of the supernatural crisis. How do I continue farming land that belongs to someone else's murdered family without feeling like I'm participating in those crimes? The psychological impact of collective historical trauma created therapeutic needs that exceeded Sarah's spiritual healing expertise. She began working with Dr. Morrison to develop counseling approaches that could help community members process inherited guilt while maintaining functional relationships within families and neighborhoods that would need to continue cooperating for economic survival. Meanwhile, the children who had been freed from spiritual possession required ongoing support to recover from their traumatic experiences as unwilling mediums for murder victims' final moments. While their physical health returned quickly, several exhibited lingering psychological effects that manifested as nightmares, anxiety about sleeping, and occasional flashbacks to memories that weren't their own. Amanda Crawford, who had nearly died while channeling Isabella Morales' murder, showed the most severe symptoms. The 12-year-old would sometimes wake screaming in Spanish about fire and burning, despite having no conscious memory of speaking that language or experiencing those particular traumatic events. Sarah's work with Amanda and the other affected children required adapting her grandmother's healing techniques to address psychological trauma that resulted from supernatural rather than conventional abuse. The traditional methods of herbal treatment and protective ritual needed to be supplemented with new approaches that could help children distinguish between their own memories and the spiritual experiences they had involuntarily absorbed. The solution that emerged combined Sarah's folk healing knowledge with innovative therapeutic techniques that Dr. Morrison developed based on his observations of the children's recovery patterns. By working together, the Polish immigrant and the frontier physician created treatment approaches that addressed both the spiritual and medical aspects of supernatural trauma in ways that neither could have accomplished independently. But Sarah's growing reputation as someone who could address supernatural problems brought requests for assistance from communities throughout Kansas and neighboring territories, where similar unexplained phenomena were affecting other populations. Letters arrived weekly from desperate families whose children were experiencing mysterious illnesses, unexplained behavioral changes, or apparent possession by unknown spiritual entities. The correspondence revealed that Millfield's supernatural crisis wasn't unique. Communities throughout the American frontier were dealing with spiritual disturbances that seemed to be connected to violent historical events that had been covered up or forgotten by populations who had benefited from those crimes. Cattle ranching community near Dodge City was experiencing supernatural disturbances that seemed to be related to massacres of buffalo soldiers who had been killed by white ranchers during conflicts over grazing rights. Children in the affected families were speaking in dialects used by African American cavalry units while describing military battles and racial violence that had occurred before their births. Coal mining families in southeastern Kansas reported children who spoke in Welsh and Irish dialects while describing cave-ins and mining disasters that had been covered up by company officials who didn't want to compensate victims' families. The affected children displayed knowledge about mining techniques and safety, hazards that no Kansas farm children should have possessed. Most disturbing were reports from railroad construction communities where children were channeling the experiences of Chinese immigrant workers who had been killed in industrial accidents and buried in unmarked graves to avoid paying death benefits to their families. The pattern that emerged from these reports suggested that Sarah's work in Millfield had revealed a broader phenomenon affecting frontier communities throughout the American West. Historical violence and injustice were creating spiritual disturbances that manifested through sensitive individuals, particularly children, who were serving as unwilling mediums for victims whose deaths had never been properly acknowledged or addressed. Sarah's decision to accept consultation requests from other affected communities represented a fundamental transformation in her understanding of her own purpose and capabilities. The mail-order bride, who had fled Chicago seeking only personal safety, had discovered that her survival depended on using her abilities to help others address spiritual crises that threatened entire populations. But expanding her healing work beyond Millfield would require Sarah to develop new skills and resources that could address the practical challenges of traveling throughout frontier territories while maintaining family responsibilities and community connections that had become central to her identity. Thomas Hartwell's response to Sarah's consultation opportunities revealed how completely their marriage arrangement had evolved from practical necessity into genuine partnership. Based on shared values and complementary capabilities, Sarah, Thomas said, using her name with the careful pronunciation he had learned during months of working to improve his basic Polish vocabulary. What you accomplished here saved not just our children, but our entire community. If other people need that same help, then we need to find ways for you to provide it. The solution they developed involved transforming their farm into a training center where Sarah could teach her healing techniques to other practitioners, while maintaining Millfield as her permanent base of operations. Students would come to Kansas to learn traditional healing methods adapted for addressing supernatural problems related to historical trauma and frontier violence. The first group of students included Dr. Morrison, who wanted to develop medical approaches to supernatural healing; Pastor Williams, whose theological education had been challenged by witnessing effective spiritual interventions that fell outside Protestant doctrine; and Catherine Mills, whose Cherokee heritage had prepared her to understand traditional healing practices that mainstream American culture had dismissed as primitive superstition. But the most significant student was Isabella Rodriguez, a young woman who had traveled from New Mexico after learning that her great-grandmother had been murdered in Kansas during the 1870s land wars. Isabella possessed both Spanish language skills and traditional Mexican healing knowledge that could complement Sarah's European folk traditions while providing cultural insights that would be essential for working with communities affected by similar historical crimes. As autumn approached and Sarah prepared for her first consultation trip to assist the Buffalo Soldier families near Dodge City, she reflected on the transformation that had brought her from desperate immigrant seeking basic survival to recognized healer whose work was addressing historical injustices throughout the American frontier. The woman who had arrived in Millfield speaking no English had developed abilities to communicate across cultural, linguistic, and spiritual boundaries that enabled her to facilitate healing between the living and the dead, between different ethnic communities, and between past and present generations, whose conflicts continued to affect contemporary populations. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah had learned that healing required more than individual recovery from personal trauma. True healing demanded community recognition of historical injustices, collective acceptance of responsibility for addressing ongoing consequences of past crimes, and sustained commitment to building relationships based on truth rather than convenient lies about uncomfortable histories. The children of Millfield were healthy and happy, their supernatural ordeal transformed into wisdom about the importance of honoring all lives regardless of language, nationality, or legal status. The community had been forced to confront difficult truths about its founding, but had emerged stronger and more honest than before. The crisis had revealed the spiritual costs of building prosperity on hidden violence, and Sarah herself had discovered that speaking English wasn't nearly as important as learning to hear what people were really saying when they asked for help, regardless of what language they used or whether they were alive or dead, present or past, visible or invisible. To others who hadn't learned that healing required listening to voices that conventional society preferred to ignore, Sarah's first consultation trip to assist the families near Dodge City introduced her to supernatural phenomena that challenged everything she thought she understood about the relationship between historical violence and spiritual manifestations. The Buffalo Soldier situation was more complex than the Millfield crisis, because it involved racial dynamics and military cover-ups that created additional layers of injustice requiring resolution. The affected children in the Dodge City area weren't just channeling the experiences of murdered soldiers, they were accessing memories of systematic betrayal by white officers who had used African-American cavalry units as expendable forces in conflicts designed to benefit cattle ranchers at the expense of military personnel who had trusted their commanders to protect them. 10-year-old Samuel Morrison, whose family had no connection to military service or African-American heritage, was speaking in the dialects and military terminology of Buffalo soldiers while demonstrating knowledge of cavalry tactics, weaponry, and regimental history that no Kansas farm child should have possessed. But unlike the Millfield children who had channeled individual murder victims, Samuel was accessing collective memories of entire military units whose deaths had been covered up through falsified records and buried evidence. The scope of the cover-up was staggering. Federal investigators working with Sarah discovered that 3 complete cavalry companies, nearly 200 soldiers, had been deliberately deployed in situations where their deaths were virtually guaranteed, then listed as missing, in action or transferred to other duties, to avoid paying death benefits to their families or acknowledging the military's complicity in racially motivated violence. Working with Isabella Rodriguez, whose Mexican healing traditions included methods for addressing collective trauma affecting entire communities, Sarah developed new ritual approaches that could address systematic injustice rather than individual murders. The ceremonies required participation from both white and African American community members, forcing racial integration that challenged social conventions. Throughout Kansas Territory, the breakthrough came when they located elderly survivors from the original Buffalo soldier units who were still living in settlements throughout the region. These men possessed first-hand knowledge of the military betrayals that had created the supernatural crisis, and their willingness to testify about covered-up crimes provided the spiritual authority necessary to negotiate peace between the dead soldiers and the living communities that had unknowingly benefited from their sacrifices. Sergeant Major James Washington, a 70-year-old Buffalo soldier who had survived the massacres that killed his fellow soldiers, became Sarah's primary collaborator in conducting healing ceremonies that honored military service while addressing racial injustices that extended far beyond individual crimes to encompass systematic military discrimination. Those boys died believing they were serving their country. Sergeant Washington explained to Sarah through Isabella's translation assistance. They need to know that their sacrifice mattered, that their service is remembered with honor, and that the people who betrayed them have been held accountable for their crimes. The resolution of the Buffalo soldier crisis required Sarah to coordinate with federal military authorities, territorial civil rights investigators, and tribal leaders whose reservations had been affected by the original conflicts between cavalry units and cattle ranchers. The complexity of these negotiations demanded diplomatic skills that went far beyond her grandmother's traditional healing knowledge. But the most significant challenge involved addressing ongoing racial tensions within communities where white families and African American families had to work together to resolve supernatural problems that affected children from both populations. The healing ceremonies couldn't succeed without genuine cooperation between racial groups that had limited experience with integrated spiritual practices. Sarah's role as cultural mediator required her to bridge not just linguistic differences, but fundamental disagreements about appropriate spiritual authority, acceptable religious practices, and the proper relationship between different racial communities within American territorial society. The solution that emerged combined elements from Sarah's Polish folk traditions, Isabella's Mexican healing methods, Sergeant Washington's African-American spiritual practices, and traditional Native American approaches to collective healing that honored multiple cultural perspectives while addressing shared supernatural problems. The integrated ceremonies that resulted from this collaboration produced healing outcomes that exceeded anything Sarah had achieved working within single cultural frameworks. The children's recovery was faster and more complete when their healing involved recognition of racial diversity rather than assumptions about cultural uniformity. But perhaps more importantly, The communities that participated in integrated healing ceremonies developed ongoing relationships that transcended racial boundaries while addressing practical challenges of frontier life that required cooperation between different ethnic populations. The success of the Buffalo Soldier intervention established Sarah's reputation as someone who could address supernatural problems related to systematic historical injustices rather than just individual crimes. Requests for consultation began, arriving from communities throughout the American West, where similar patterns of covered-up violence were creating spiritual disturbances that affected contemporary populations. A mining community in Colorado reported children who were channeling the experiences of Chinese railroad workers who had been killed in deliberate explosions designed to eliminate Asian labor competition. The affected children displayed knowledge of engineering techniques and spoke in Cantonese dialects while describing industrial murders that had been covered up by railroad companies and local officials. Farming communities in Nebraska were dealing with supernatural disturbances related to massacres of German immigrant families who had been killed during anti-foreign violence that followed economic depressions in the 1870s. Children in these areas were speaking German while accessing memories of systematic persecution that had been covered up to avoid federal investigation of territorial civil rights violations. Most disturbing were reports from California settlements where children were channeling the experiences of Native American families who had been systematically murdered during gold rush violence that had been deliberately covered up by mining. Companies and territorial authorities who wanted to avoid federal intervention in profitable operations. The pattern that emerged from these reports revealed that supernatural disturbances were occurring throughout frontier communities where rapid economic development had been achieved through systematic violence against vulnerable populations whose deaths had been covered up to avoid legal consequences or moral accountability. Sarah's understanding of this broader phenomenon led to her development of training programs that could prepare other healers to address supernatural problems related to historical injustices without requiring her personal involvement in every case. The demand for her consultation services had grown beyond what any individual practitioner could handle, necessitating the creation of systematic approaches that could be learned and implemented by others. The training center that she and Thomas established on their expanded farm began attracting students from throughout the American territories and beyond. Medical professionals wanted to learn therapeutic approaches that could address supernatural trauma. Religious leaders sought to understand spiritual healing methods that worked outside conventional denominational frameworks. Social reformers hoped to develop community healing techniques that could address historical injustices while building more equitable relationships between different ethnic populations. But the most dedicated students were individuals who possessed cultural backgrounds that connected them to populations affected by frontier violence. Mexican Americans whose families had lost land through illegal seizures, African Americans whose relatives had been killed in military cover-ups, Native Americans whose tribes had been subjected to systematic genocide, and European immigrants whose communities had faced persecution based on ethnic or religious differences. These students brought traditional healing knowledge from their own cultures that complemented Sarah's folk methods, while providing insights into spiritual practices that had been developed specifically to address collective trauma and historical injustice. The combination of diverse healing traditions created therapeutic approaches that were more effective than any single cultural method could achieve independently. Isabella Rodriguez emerged as Sarah's primary teaching partner, her Mexican healing knowledge providing crucial insights into addressing supernatural problems that involve systematic rather than individual violence. Isabella's understanding of traditional methods for healing collective trauma enabled the training program to address large-scale historical injustices that affected entire ethnic communities rather than just individual families. The collaborative relationship between Sarah and Isabella also demonstrated possibilities for cross-cultural cooperation that challenged prevailing assumptions about racial and ethnic relationships within American territorial society. Their joint teaching sessions attracted participants from diverse backgrounds who learned to work together on healing projects that required integrated approaches to supernatural problems. Dr. Morrison's participation in the training program provided medical legitimacy that enabled supernatural healing methods to gain acceptance within mainstream healthcare systems throughout the frontier territories. His documentation of successful outcomes from traditional healing approaches convinced other physicians that folk methods could complement conventional medical treatments for conditions that exceeded normal therapeutic knowledge. Pastor Williams's involvement addressed religious objections to supernatural healing by demonstrating that traditional spiritual practices could enhance rather than challenge Christian faith when properly understood and implemented. His theological interpretation of Sarah's methods helped other Protestant clergy accept healing approaches that fell outside conventional denominational frameworks. But the most significant development in Sarah's expanding healing work came when federal authorities began requesting her consultation on policy issues related to addressing historical injustices that were creating ongoing social problems throughout American territories. Her expertise in resolving supernatural crises had revealed systematic patterns of cover-up and violence that required government intervention to prevent continued spiritual disturbances. The Department of Interior established a special commission to investigate reports of supernatural phenomena related to historical crimes, with Sarah serving as primary consultant on cases that involve spiritual disturbances affecting vulnerable populations. Her work with this commission would take her throughout the American West, documenting patterns of violence and developing policies that could address historical injustices while preventing future supernatural crises. The Commission's first major investigation involved systematic massacres of Native American families that had been covered up during reservation establishment processes throughout multiple territories. The scale of these crimes exceeded anything Sarah had previously encountered, involving thousands of murder victims whose deaths had been systematically hidden by federal officials who wanted to avoid public scrutiny of Indian policy implementation. Children throughout reservation communities were experiencing supernatural disturbances that involved channeling the final moments of entire tribes that had been wiped out during forced relocation programs. The affected populations included not just Native American children, but also white and Mexican American children whose families lived on land that had been acquired through these hidden genocides. The federal investigation that followed Sarah's initial assessment revealed documentation of systematic murder covering decades of Indian policy implementation. Military records that had been classified to prevent public disclosure contained detailed accounts of deliberate killings that had been disguised as combat casualties or natural deaths from disease and starvation. But addressing supernatural disturbances related to systematic genocide required healing approaches that exceeded anything Sarah had previously developed. The traditional methods that had been effective for resolving individual murders or small-scale community violence weren't adequate for addressing collective trauma that involved the deliberate destruction of entire cultures and ethnic populations. The solution required Sarah to work directly with traditional Native American healers, whose spiritual knowledge included methods for addressing genocide and cultural destruction that had been developed through centuries of experience with systematic persecution. These indigenous healing practitioners possessed techniques for collective spiritual healing that could address trauma affecting entire ethnic populations rather than just individual families or communities. The collaboration between Sarah's European folk healing traditions and traditional Native American spiritual practices created new approaches to supernatural healing that could address historical injustices of unprecedented scope and complexity. These integrated methods would become essential for addressing supernatural problems throughout the American frontier, where rapid territorial expansion had been achieved through systematic violence against indigenous populations whose deaths continued to create spiritual disturbances affecting contemporary communities. As Sarah prepared for her most challenging assignment, addressing supernatural disturbances related to the systematic genocide of Native American populations throughout the American West, she reflected on the transformation that had brought her from desperate immigrant seeking basic survival to federal consultant whose work was revealing hidden histories that challenged fundamental assumptions about American territorial development and the relationship between historical violence and contemporary social problems. The Commission's investigation into the systematic genocide of Native American populations brought Sarah face to face with spiritual trauma that dwarfed everything she had previously encountered. The Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota had become the epicenter of supernatural disturbances affecting not just indigenous children, but white settlers' families throughout a 300-mile radius, where the echoes of the Wounded Knee massacre continued to reverberate through the spiritual landscape. Unlike the localized hauntings in Millfield or the military cover-ups near Dodge City, the Pine Ridge situation involved the systematic destruction of an entire way of life. The children affected by these spiritual disturbances weren't just channeling individual murder victims. They were accessing the collective death agonies of a civilization that had been deliberately exterminated through coordinated government policies designed to erase Native American existence from the American continent. Sarah's arrival at Pine Ridge coincided with the most severe supernatural crisis the reservation had experienced since the original massacre. 43 children across multiple tribal communities were simultaneously possessed by the spirits of massacre victims, speaking in ancient Lakota dialects, while their bodies contorted to replicate the final moments of people who had been shot, bayoneted, or frozen to death during the systematic killing that had followed the ghost dance religious movement. The federal officials who had requested Sarah's intervention were overwhelmed by the scope of spiritual manifestations that challenged every assumption about the relationship between historical violence and contemporary social problems. Territorial. Governor Samuel Crawford had witnessed possessed children demonstrating wounds that appeared and disappeared on their bodies, recreating the physical trauma experienced by massacre victims while speaking prophecies about the future of American expansion that proved disturbingly accurate. "Mrs. Hartwell," Governor Crawford said during their initial briefing at Fort Robinson, "we're dealing with phenomena that exceed anything in federal experience with Indian affairs. These children aren't just sick, they're serving as conduits for spiritual forces that seem determined to prevent us from forgetting what happened here, regardless of the political consequences." The political implications of acknowledging the supernatural crisis were staggering. Admitting that government policies had created spiritual disturbances affecting multiple territories would require federal recognition of systematic genocide, criminal prosecution of military and civilian officials, and reparations that could bankrupt territorial budgets throughout the American West. But Sarah's initial assessment of the possessed children revealed that ignoring the crisis would result in escalating supernatural violence that could make entire regions uninhabitable for both indigenous and settler populations. The spirits of the Wounded Knee victims weren't seeking individual justice. They were demanding acknowledgement of cultural destruction that had eliminated entire ways of life from the American continent. Working with traditional Lakota healers led by medicine man Black Elk, Sarah began developing healing approaches that could address genocide rather than individual murders. The traditional Native American understanding of spiritual balance emphasized collective rather than individual healing, requiring community-wide recognition of cultural destruction and systematic efforts to restore spiritual harmony between indigenous and settler populations. Black Elk's teachings about the relationship between historical trauma and contemporary spiritual health provided Sarah with conceptual frameworks that went far beyond her grandmother's European folk healing traditions. The Lakota understanding of spiritual interconnectedness revealed that the supernatural disturbances affecting children throughout the region were symptoms of cultural imbalance that required restoration of proper relationships between different ethnic populations. The children carry voices that speak for all our people who died without proper burial, without proper ceremony, without their deaths being acknowledged by those who killed them, Black Elk explained through his grandson's translation. The spirits cannot rest until the living learn to hear what they are saying about how to restore balance between the peoples who share this land. The healing ceremonies that emerged from collaboration between Sarah's folk traditions and Lakota spiritual practices required participation from both indigenous and settler communities, forcing cultural integration that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial relationships within American territorial society. The rituals couldn't succeed without genuine cooperation between populations that had been systematically isolated from each other through federal policies designed to prevent indigenous influence on American territorial development. Sarah's role as cultural mediator required her to facilitate communication between Lakota spiritual leaders and federal officials who had no framework for understanding indigenous concepts of collective healing and spiritual balance. The negotiations that followed tested her diplomatic skills in ways that exceeded anything she had encountered during previous supernatural interventions. The breakthrough came when Sarah and Black Elk developed integrated ceremonies that combined Polish folk healing methods with traditional Lakota spiritual practices, creating new approaches to collective healing that honored both European and indigenous traditions while addressing shared supernatural problems affecting both settler and Native American populations. The joint healing rituals required federal officials to participate alongside tribal leaders in ceremonies that acknowledged systematic genocide while committing to policy changes that would address ongoing spiritual consequences of historical violence. The federal government agreed to provide reparations, return sacred lands, and establish educational programs that would teach accurate histories of Indian settler relations rather than sanitized narratives that covered up systematic crimes. But the most significant outcome of the Pine Ridge intervention was Sarah's discovery that supernatural healing could address not just historical injustices, but ongoing patterns of violence and cultural destruction that continued to affect vulnerable populations throughout American territorial expansion. The success of the integrated healing ceremonies attracted international attention from governments dealing with similar patterns of colonial violence and cultural destruction. Representatives from Canada, Australia, and Mexico requested consultation about addressing supernatural disturbances related to systematic violence against indigenous populations in their own territories. Sarah's expanding international work required her to develop healing approaches that could address colonial violence as a global phenomenon rather than just an American territorial problem. The patterns of systematic murder, cultural destruction, and historical cover-up that had created supernatural crises throughout the American West were being replicated worldwide. Wherever European populations encountered indigenous societies, they sought to displace or destroy. Working with traditional healers from multiple continents, Sarah began developing universal principles for addressing supernatural problems related to colonial violence and cultural genocide. These integrated healing methods combined traditional knowledge from diverse indigenous cultures with European folk healing traditions that had originally been developed to address similar patterns of systematic violence within European contexts. The training programs that evolved from this international collaboration created networks of healers who could address supernatural problems related to historical injustices while building cultural relationships based on mutual respect rather than systematic domination. Students traveled from throughout the world to learn healing methods that could restore spiritual balance between populations whose conflicts had created ongoing supernatural disturbances. Isabella Rodriguez's role in these international programs provided crucial insights into addressing colonial violence that had affected Mexican and Latin American populations through patterns similar to those that had devastated Native American communities. Her traditional Mexican healing knowledge included methods for addressing systematic cultural destruction that complemented Native American spiritual practices while providing approaches that could be adapted to different geographical and cultural contexts. The collaboration between Sarah, Isabella, Black Elk, and other traditional healers from diverse cultures created healing methodologies that transcended individual cultural limitations while addressing universal patterns of colonial violence and cultural destruction. These integrated approaches proved more effective than any single cultural tradition could achieve independently when addressing systematic historical injustices. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of Sarah's work involved the children who had been freed from supernatural possession through these healing interventions. The young people who had survived spiritual trauma related to historical violence became advocates for cultural understanding and historical truth-telling that would prevent future supernatural crises while building more equitable relationships between different ethnic populations. Benjamin Walker, who had been the first child Sarah helped in Millfield, grew up to become a teacher who specialized in educating frontier communities about accurate historical narratives that acknowledged rather than covered up patterns of violence and injustice that had shaped American territorial development. His classroom instruction helped prevent supernatural disturbances by ensuring that historical crimes were remembered and acknowledged rather than forgotten or denied. Amanda Crawford developed abilities to communicate with spiritual entities that enabled her to serve as a mediator in supernatural crises affecting other communities. Her childhood experience surviving spiritual possession had taught her techniques for protecting other children from similar trauma while facilitating healing. Communication between the living and the dead. Emily Foster became a translator and cultural mediator who worked with international organizations addressing colonial violence and cultural destruction worldwide. Her multilingual abilities and experience with supernatural healing made her invaluable for addressing spiritual crises that required communication across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The children who had been saved by Sarah's healing work became the foundation for a new generation of cultural leaders who understood that acknowledging difficult historical truths was essential for preventing ongoing spiritual and social problems affecting contemporary populations. Sarah's final project involved establishing a permanent institute for supernatural healing that could address ongoing patterns of historical violence while training future generations of healers to recognize and resolve spiritual crises before they escalated to levels that threatened entire communities. The International Institute for Historical Healing, located on expanded grounds surrounding Sarah and Thomas's original farm, became a center for research and education about the relationship between historical violence and contemporary spiritual health. Students from throughout the world studied integrated healing methods while conducting research into supernatural phenomena related to systematic injustices affecting vulnerable populations. The Institute's work revealed that supernatural disturbances were occurring worldwide, wherever rapid economic development had been achieved, through systematic violence against indigenous populations, ethnic minorities, or other vulnerable groups whose deaths had been covered, up to avoid legal consequences or moral accountability. But the Institute also documented successful healing interventions that had restored spiritual balance between conflicting populations, while addressing historical injustices through truth-telling, reparations, and cultural reconciliation rather than continued violence or denial. The principles that emerged from this international research emphasized that supernatural healing required more than individual recovery from personal trauma. Effective spiritual healing demanded community recognition of historical injustices, collective acceptance of responsibility for addressing ongoing consequences of systematic violence, and sustained commitment to building relationships based on truth rather than convenient lies about uncomfortable histories. As Sarah reached her 60th birthday, she reflected on the transformation that had brought her from desperate mail-order bride speaking no English to internationally recognized expert on supernatural healing whose work had influenced government policies throughout multiple continents. The woman who had fled Chicago seeking only personal safety had discovered that her survival depended on using her abilities to address spiritual crises that threatened entire populations. The immigrant who had struggled to communicate in broken English had learned to facilitate healing communication between the living and the dead, between different ethnic communities, and between past and present generations whose conflicts continued to affect contemporary social problems. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah had demonstrated that individual healing was inseparable from collective healing, that personal recovery required community recognition of shared historical traumas, and that spiritual health demanded honest acknowledgement of difficult truths about the relationship between historical violence and contemporary social problems. The children of Millfield, now adults with families of their own, continued to benefit from the healing they had received through Sarah's interventions. But they also carried forward the understanding that protecting vulnerable populations from spiritual and physical violence required constant vigilance and sustained commitment to justice rather than convenience or comfort. Thomas Hartwell, whose marriage proposal had inadvertently brought Sarah to a community that desperately needed her healing abilities, had evolved from practical farmer-seeking domestic partnership into advocate for international cooperation on addressing historical injustices. His support for Sarah's expanding work had enabled healing interventions that affected millions of people throughout multiple continents. The mail-order bride who had spoken no English. Until she started healing, cursed children had found her voice by listening to voices that had been silenced through systematic violence and historical cover-up. Her legacy lived on through the countless individuals who had learned that healing required courage to confront difficult truths about the past, determination to address ongoing consequences of historical injustices, and commitment to building relationships based on mutual respect rather than systematic domination. The International Institute for Historical Healing continued Sarah's work long after her death, training new generations of healers who understood that supernatural phenomena were often symptoms of unaddressed historical traumas that required spiritual intervention combined with practical Action to address ongoing social problems affecting vulnerable populations, the Institute's motto, carved in multiple languages above its main entrance, reflected the fundamental truth that Sarah had discovered through her journey from desperate immigrant to internationally recognized healer. The voices of the dead speak through the living until justice is restored and truth replaces the convenient lies that allow violence to continue unchallenged. Sarah's story became a testament to the power of individual courage to address collective trauma, the importance of cross-cultural cooperation in healing historical injustices, and the understanding that speaking truth about difficult histories was essential for preventing ongoing spiritual and social problems that affected contemporary populations worldwide. The children she had, saved by learning to hear their supernatural distress, became adults who carried forward the knowledge that healing required listening to voices that others preferred to ignore, whether those voices belonged to the living or the dead, the present or the past, the visible or the invisible members of communities that had been torn apart by violence but could be restored through truth, justice, and sustained commitment to protecting all lives regardless of language, nationality, legal status, or spiritual condition. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.